Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the very good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program here at the center. And in today's context, directing our HELPS project, Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security. We take an explicit kitchen sink approach to these issues because they are so inextricably linked. But we also try to drill down in those different topics, and we are clearly doing that today, both to better understand population projections and know the assumptions behind them and what they imply, but also as a tool for those of you in the audience and watching online who are not necessarily in the pop world, but need to better understand how these projections, demography and population issues connect to your portfolios, because as we see them here, there are all sorts of connections, and I think some of those connections will come out in today's panel, and certainly I expect it to come out in the discussion. As I think many of you know, we're sitting at the formal memorial to Wilson. So the Wilson Center was founded in '68 by Congress as the formal memorial to Wilson, our only president to have a PhD. So it's a living memorial where the worlds of scholarship and policy and practice come together. It's reflected in our panel here, certainly reflected in the folks sitting around the table. And our environmental change and security program that's grappled with these issues, we've been around since 1994 doing much of the same, bringing scholarship and policy together and then different components of the policy community together. We have had the good fortune with our HELPS program and other programs previous to have support and partnership with USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. So it's great to see some of those folks here today. And it continues to be a collaboration that allows these kinds of discussions. In fact, even yesterday, welcome back to a number of you who were in this same room yesterday at 3 o'clock, not even 24 hours ago, to tackle some similar issues. But I'm going to turn the floor over to our distinguished panel. We really have an all-star panel on this topic for you today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll speak. Carl Hub is somebody, well, all these folks are known to you, so I'll keep it very brief and just suggest that you look at the handouts for the details. But Carl, as you know, is demographer and now senior visiting scholar, but longtime affiliated with the Population Reference Bureau, really a go-to resource in town and really internationally on population projections and understanding them, and that's in part because he and PRB have been very clever in communicating that information, but also really understanding it and analyzing it. So it's terrific to have Carl back at the Wilson Center. Hanya Zlotnick, again, I think you know, has just stepped down from being the director. She's a former director of the Population Division in the United Nations, where these numbers are brought together and where they come from for all of us to try to understand. So it's under her leadership that there have been all sorts of, I think, critical advances in our understanding these issues and breaking it down, giving us longer timelines to look at, and a variety of issues that she'll share her insights from that vantage point. And it's terrific to welcome her to the center. And then finally, Rachel Nugent, who is now Research Associate Professor in the Department of Global Health at the University of Washington, where she also directs the Disease Control Priorities Network. Rachel's been somebody who has also been at PRB and Center for Global Development, has been very active on these issues, particularly in their connections to economic growth issues here in Washington, in academia, as well as the policy circles as well. So it's terrific to welcome Rachel back to the center as well. So we'll turn the floor over to Carl. We'll have the 3 presentations and opportunity for Q&A. We are webcasting the session live. For those of you watching online, you should be able to pull up the slides there directly on your computer so that you can see them much easier than trying to discern them behind our speakers' shoulders here in the room. And what it means for us here in the room is when it does come time for the Q&A, we ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone and pose your question, as opposed to making a speech. Pose your question into the mic and tell us who you are so the folks online can hear it as well. So, Carl, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you. So we're here today to look at projections that put out by the UN and various things from the Population Reference Bureau, like our data sheet, which demographer David Coleman once wonderfully called weapons of mass instruction. And I've stolen that joke many times, but how right he is in many ways. People call up and they'll ask, well, what does the United Nations project for Nigeria for the year 2025? And not to be a wise guy, and actually I don't really always do it, but I'll say, would you like to know what the United Nations assumed about Nigeria up to the year 2025? But I'm not like that, so I tell them and then gently say, and that assumes that, okay. I show you, I do a lot of talks to people outside the field, believe it or not. There are people who do not go around every day thinking about demography, and I try to get something that'll, get their attention. And here's a few that really do. This is one of those wonderful statistical accidents that at the beginning of the last century, we had that many people in the world, and at the end, the two numbers simply changed places. Who designed that? The next one, you can say rapid population growth, you can say whatever you want, but a picture always tells 1,000 words. And actually, I threw this in at the last minute, so that's not the right lead-in. This is I discovered this. It's a copy of Time magazine in 1960. That's 8 years before the population bomb was published. And if you'll notice, the banner says, that population explosion, as if we all knew about it. In any event, people get this right away. Population pyramids set the stage. They tell us a lot about an area's past and a great deal about its future. And here we see the developed or rich countries. Not much of a pyramid, and this instantly tells us what? No population growth coming. But then I show them this one on the same scale, and you ought to see the reaction. People understand this instantly. So I think that things like this are very good for making people think about the future. So how do you make it? How do you make a projection? Well, you need a base population, and people often forget that. You have to start with something. What's the population of Nigeria? What's the population of Bangladesh? You have to know that first. Also, a date, let's say 2000 or 2005, it's the past, but it may be a projection. It may be based on a census in 1990. So past numbers can be projections. You then have to make assumptions about the birth rate, what's going to happen, and we can leave all of this for discussion. I think Hanya will cover it too. The trend in life expectancy, infant mortality, and then finally something that most countries know very little about, immigration and emigration. Who's coming, who's going, how many? The key variable, of course, is the total fertility rate, the average number of children, which you all know, so we won't spend much time. And the United Nations is very careful to point out that to achieve reductions in fertility, the underlying assumption is that there will be use of family planning will spread, and of course, implied, effective use of family planning. And there's kind of two different things. And they go on to say and point out the consequences of fertility not coming down. I'll let you read this rather long and wordy sentence to yourself later. How well has the United Nations done? Actually, pretty darn well when you look at the world total. And the left-hand darker bar is the world population as projected by the UN in 1982, and then what it actually is believed to be or estimated to be for 2010. And you can see for yourself, and also out to 2025, that they're really pretty close. If I had done this, I'd be like, hey, so. Pat on the back. Now, Africa is a little bit different. Demographers throughout history have said we do not take into account wars, famines, and epidemics in our projections. And HIV changed all of that. And I think here you can see the result of it. So, how well do projections do in projecting fertility? So, once again, we have the 1982 projection by the UN of the total fertility rate and what the current TFR is likely to approximately be now. You can see some were a little optimistic, some were pretty close to right on, and others were too pessimistic. And this is the kind of thing we have to do when we look at a projection. We have to think for ourselves, do I agree with that? Is that likely? from what I've heard from the country, I think their family planning program is going to expand. I think that it'll come down faster. Or I don't think it's going to come down at all. So like a mathematical curve on a projection may not be borne out whatsoever. So here are the assumptions being made for Africa, for the different regions, on how the total fertility rate will come down. And you can see by mid-century, most have come down to quite a low level, although not as quite as low as the UN had projected in the past. So definitely taking into account the fact that fertility decline is slower. Now here we have a projection for Mozambique, which the projection was a bit too optimistic. And I might say quickly, how do we know all this? Most of you are familiar with it, but remember, we're talking about countries that don't have registered births and deaths. I can get on the Swedish website and see how many babies were born in March of this year. But you can't do that in Africa or most developing countries. This all started in the 1970s with the World Fertility Survey. In fact, I remember I took a course from Dr. Ridley at Georgetown with the very title, and being brand new to the field, I wasn't that impressed with the World Fertility Survey, but Dr. Ridley was extremely excited about it, and I rather quickly learned why. Where would we be without the World Fertility Survey and all of its descendants, such as the DHS, the Demographic and Health Survey, the RHS? They're not perfect, but my heavens, the view they give us at what is going on in the country and what the future might be is amazing. Here's a country, Bangladesh, in which I think. Oh, by the way, I tossed in the international database of the U.S. Census Bureau now, since you can pull this offline. These are two major organizations that are cited by many people. Bangladesh, it looks like, you have to say they're pretty much right on. And Rwanda has been a bit of a surprise now, with its total fertility rate coming down a little bit faster than had been projected. Now we look at some grimmer reality, if you will, for the poor population projector. If you were to look at these countries in Africa, got the right? Yes. When is fertility going to come down in a serious way in any of these countries? It's, we sometimes tend to criticize assumptions and say, oh, I don't think that's possible. Well, if you say something like that, then, or if I said something like that, say, okay, smarty, tell me what's going to happen then, if you know more than the UN or the Census Bureau. So it's always been, I guess, conventional is a good word, to assume that birth rates will come down the way they did in the rich countries, that they'll come down in the poor countries. That's been a convention. Nobody really likes to project a population with a constant TFR, although the UN does show us what would happen if the TFR, didn't come down. Something else that people tend to forget is when you make three projections, an odd number, 5, there's always one in the middle. And people tend to just toss out the other two, whereas the UN has gone to an awful lot of trouble to show us various projections of population. I remember once years ago, the U.S. Census Bureau put out 4 projections of U.S. states and labeled them A, B, C, and D. 4. And reporters would ask me, well, which one should I use? Believe me, that was an Excedrin week. You can't tell California to use that and New York to use this. But when you have an odd number, you've got a middle. And so that satisfies everybody. So slow fertility decline is not isolated to sub-Saharan Africa. But we can see that in countries that have had some decline, that we have frequently the famous stall. Why is that? And I think that's good fodder for discussion later, that in the beginning of a family planning, did you get the couples or the women who were ready for it? Is that what happened? They were all ready to go to reduce their family size, but then as you approach a middle level, perhaps the rural TFR comes down more slowly, so the national TFR comes down more slowly. And of course, it happens differently in many different places. Sub-Saharan Africa, which of course is today's major issue in terms of high fertility, you see some very high usage of modern contraception sometimes, 33% modern contraception in Zambia with a TFR of 6.2. Well, how does that happen? Well, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, the methods used are temporary or short-acting methods. Injection, of course, is one of the main ones, and usually good for about 90 days unless they have some new ones. So I think when you see 33% usage, and then in the next survey you see 32% usage or something, it's not the same women. They're coming and going from that use population, if you see what I mean. That it's not like the 33% using it this year kept on using it and others added to it. They're transiting in and out of the contracepting population. So now we look at projected TFRs versus very recent surveys. We happen to have had a real flurry of DHS surveys come out on sub-Saharan Africa recently, and some of them contain some real surprises. So you can take a look at that. In particular, Tanzania, 5.4, which is about the same as the UN had projected. Burundi. Now, to be fair, we haven't had a survey from Burundi, I think, since the 1980s, so nobody really knew what was going on there. So when it came out, it was extremely high at 6.4. Sub-Saharan African countries do say, when asked, that they have a policy to reduce fertility, and you can see how the number increased. There are still a few. There's one that says too low. I meant to look that up, but I think it's Mauritius. Some of the developing countries that have low birth rates are beginning to worry about them, which is a kind of a reversal. So at least in terms of what they respond to the UN, they say, yeah, we're worried about fertility. One other observation I'd like to make is what we are really assuming about developing countries. Now, the fertility decline period graphed here for Bangladesh, the blue line, is basically my career. So to me, it looks like fertility came down very slowly from decade to decade. But that's not the case. What we're asking developing countries to do is to have an overwhelming social change in 1 or 2 generations. In the U.S., it took us 130-some years to reach near the replacement level. And, of course, then we bounced right back after the war and all of that. But when TFRs come down in developing countries, they're doing it quickly. And just to show that, yes, there have been successes, and definitely, and not many in Africa, but still, that we can see fertility, yes, has come down in these countries and a few more. What's interesting is there's a lot of press articles now from Malaysia and Thailand who are looking north to Korea and Japan and seeing the aging, and they're beginning to worry. And in Malaysia in particular, they might start a program to encourage childbearing because they don't want to see these percent 65 and overs. And just one little graph, too, because, we see a lot of this in a variety of countries where the total fertility rate comes down. But as it approaches 2, it does not necessarily keep right on going, the way has happened in Europe. And so, among other things, this will have a big consequence for aging in developing countries and also for population growth. I mean, many are not showing a tendency to go to 1.4, that is for sure. DHS has provided us with all sorts of interesting questions about women's fertility intentions, and you can look at these in more detail later because I'm going to stick to my time, I think. But notice how this covers about a 20-year period for Egypt, Indonesia, and Jordan. And the number of children women say is ideal doesn't change. Now, ideal is a little soft. That's a little hard to define. But still, it's an indication of something. Here's 3 others, Uganda, Zambia, and Niger. And both Uganda and Zambia, I think, potentially show that there's some possibility of decline. Somebody asked me about a year ago, is it true men in Niger give 11 children as their ideal? I said, oh, no, that's not possible. Come on, So I went and looked it up. I said, well, yes, it is. And the women have 9, so there you are. This is a variable I like to look at in DHSs in high fertility countries. Doesn't work that well in low fertility. Is that there's a table there that says, would you like to stop childbearing immediately? And it's shown by the number of living children a woman has. And I think it's interesting when that crosses 50%. So when 50% of women say, I want to stop childbearing, okay, how many children do they have? And you can see that that's a fairly high number in some of the developing countries. 6++ in Niger. I've never put a plus down before. Half the women in Pakistan, when half the women in Pakistan say that they want to stop childbearing, they average 3 children. Another issue to keep in mind is fertility is often not even across countries. In India, for example, the heavily populated north, those 2 states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have 300 million people, which is fairly amazing, and that is where growth is going to be. The much vaunted state of Kerala, with a low TFR, has 34 million people, 1/10 that of UP and Bihar, and we have not even started to talk about Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and all the others. So in India, it's very important to watch fertility at the state level. There was good news over the last 10 years. Prior to the DHS taking blood samples and testing people for HIV, the very poor non-representative samples ultimately caused HIV to be overestimated. But as you can see here, when the DHS, nationally representative sample, took blood, that it was found that HIV was very low. It was lower than had been estimated. Finally, we turn to the other side of midnight here, the developed countries. Now, the fertility trends, I think, in developed countries will have an effect on them, but in the future, it may have a big effect on the developing. Look at Germany now. They're a 1.5 total fertility rate since the 1970s. I mean, that is a long time. And now we have France. Is that France? Yes, Sweden, I beg your pardon. Yeah, this is called the Swedish roller coaster, that it responds to employment trends. And now we have Italy. And really, you know, a lot of people didn't pay attention to low fertility in Europe until Italy had the lowest. Although it actually didn't, but people thought it did. But anyway, but everybody was calling up about that. How could that be, you know? And then we have the good old USA. Is that the right one? No, it's France.
That's France.
Finally got France in on the action there. France, of course, is very proud of its higher fertility rate than the rest of Europe, and their well, they are, and their support of young families since the 1930s has really been excellent, and also of 2-earner families, very, very good. There's the U.S. U.S. sort of looks a little bit like a developing country there in the beginning, but that was the height of the baby boom. And also one fun fact is that our lowest TFR in our history in the U.S. was 1.7. That was in 1976, the year of the bicentennial. So whatever that meant, I don't know, but, you know. But now, and this has escaped a lot of people's attention, the TFR has now dropped to 1.9. So recession has had quite an effect, and especially among Hispanics. The last 2 slides, we can see how this pyramid of Germany is pre-programmed for aging and decline. And I giving some talks in Germany, I said, you know, the government's trying to raise the birth rate, and if Germany's TFR went from 135 to 165, it would make headlines, would it not? They said, oh, definitely. I said, it's not going to matter. And when they saw this, they got it. They said, oh. I said, you can't go back. Remember there was a T-shirt that said, oh, no, I forgot to have children? You can't do that. I mean, you know, you've got 40 years here of low fertility. And, of course, Japan is just another example, roughly the same. By Japan's own national projections, they will have 40% population 65 and over. By the year 2050, they now have about 23% of the population 65 and over. And the last thing they needed was a tsunami, because one of the things they had to cut was additional funds for their Angel Plan, which is to encourage young couples to have children. So I hope I stayed in 20 minutes. And, one other thing. The solution, is it immigration? To some Europeans it is, to some Europeans it isn't. This is a pretty touchy subject when you give talks in Europe, but we can see the increase in the foreign stock in these countries. And, I said assumptions first, results last. There you are. I stuck to my promise. So we'll lead into Hanya here. This picture has not changed in 40 years. The fact that all population growth will be in developing countries. The only thing we don't know is how high that top line may go. Finally got to the end. Thank you. Sure.
But someone has to turn my presentation.
Yeah, they have to do that.
And to go forward with
The right-hand one, yeah.
Okay. So, my presentation will be more or less the same thing that Carl has told you in great detail, but with less detail. And the most important thing is that it's based on a global view of the world using the United Nations population projections. And you will forgive me because since I left the United Nations only 3 months ago, I still tend to speak of them as we, but in fact it's them, it's not I. Okay, you may have seen this graph before. It is the history of the population of the world up to the 7 billion that has happened only recently. At the end of 2011, according to us, according to some other people, it might have happened at the beginning of this year. It's a number that is a moving target. It will change as data from more censuses of the countries of the world come in. So the exact timing of the reaching 7 billion is going to move. But the important thing is that even though Carl said, well, what population explosion, you see there that, yes, there was a population explosion. The change of either 1.6 billion at the beginning of the century to 7 billion in 2011, or 2.5 billion in 1950 to 7 billion in 2011 is something that hasn't happened before so fast in the history of humanity, and one really hopes it won't happen again. But for it not to happen again, our projections, that means the ones of the United Nations, need to become a reality. And for them to become a reality, the assumptions on which they are based need to become a reality. And what we're always hoping at the UN is that whatever we say there, the world will follow. It's not that we know what the world is going to do, but we hope that they will get the message of, if this doesn't happen, you're in trouble. So the medium variant, which is the central one, and that this time the UN has made it to go to 2100, it shows that the population of the world will continue to grow and may even reach something like 10 billion at the end of the century. It's the projection that everyone quotes because in 2050 it gets to 9.3 billion people, and everyone is sure that the United Nations knows that the population in 2050 is going to be 9 billion. And that is very important for other issues that have to do with sustainability, because I've been attending meetings of people that are really keen on understanding basic things like, are we going to be able to feed this population? And the experts tell me that to feed 9 billion people living better than the standards of living that we have today, one needs to increase agricultural production or all the production of food by about 70%. And that is a challenge, but it might be feasible. But if the numbers go higher, going above 70%, they think it's impossible. So when we make the high projection, which happens to differ from the medium only by the fact that every country has half a child more on average in terms of fertility, and we get to already some over 10 billion in 2050, that would be already causing serious problems of sustainability. So it is important in some way to get to the medium projection, and that's what I'm going to talk about. What would it take to get there? So for me, the world, for everyone that studies politics and who knows geography, the world is divided into the continents, and that's what Carl has been talking about, and I'll revert to that because everyone in the UN system uses regions that are geographical. But in terms of fertility, we have the world that is more varied than ever before, and that is divided, according to me, in 3 groups. The low fertility countries that today account for 42% of the world population. That's the first number you see there. There are 74 countries. They're the majority of countries, and they all have fertility at this moment that is below replacement level. They're like the countries that Carl mentioned at the end, not France, but the Italy's, Germany's, etc., Japan's, whose population is slated to decline in the future because their fertility is so low. The intermediate the reason that we have such a high proportion of the population living in those countries is that China belongs to that group. The intermediate fertility countries are those that have fertility that is still above replacement level, but it's not too high. It's essentially the ones where every woman is having between 1 and 1.5 daughters that will survive to reproduction. So that means every generation will grow at most by 50%. They account for 40% of the population. They are 65 countries in number, and they account for so much of the population because India belongs to that group. And then we have are the high fertility countries, the Nigers, the Yemens, the Afghanistans, most of sub-Saharan Africa, that account for just 18% of the population. There are 58 countries, and they're mostly among the poorest of the world. And you will see that my attention is focused mostly on this 18%, because people have seen these numbers and they mostly say, well, there's no longer a population problem. Because see, 82% of the population lives in countries that might not grow that much. 42 will decline, the other ones are not going to grow that much. But what they forget is that with exponential growth, if you have a very small proportion of the population that keeps on growing very fast for very long, that small proportion will repopulate the whole world. And that's why the interest is in those countries that, as Carl has very nicely shown, they are lagging behind in the reduction of fertility. Now, the next thing shows the map of where those countries are. The green is the low fertility countries, and you see that the latest news is that Brazil has joined that group. It includes all the developed countries, plus China, Russia, and some developing countries in North Africa. We have Tunisia, and we have the Islamic Republic of Iran also, and several Southeast Asian countries. Then the yellow is the countries that are the intermediate fertility, and notice that the U.S. is among them because it has just replacement fertility. But it has most of North Africa, most of Southern Africa. So you see that not all of Africa is high fertility. And the red ones are the ones that are the high fertility countries, and they are mostly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, without South Africa, Southern Africa. But they also have Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and several countries in Central America, and Bolivia and Haiti that you don't see there. So it's not just the African countries that are of concern. Now, it's important to me to show you that these countries, the high fertility countries, this is their total fertility according to time starting in 1950. And you show the fertility of the world that came down from about 5 children per woman, and is now about 2.4. It's been cut in half. That's the pink line in the middle. The intermediate fertility countries are similar to what the world was doing. It came down the fertility from 5.4 children per woman to 2.4 today. The low fertility countries, amazingly, from the very beginning had a lot fewer children, 4.4, and now have an average of 1.6. So you see they have very low fertility on average. But the high fertility were also selected from the beginning by having very high fertility, 6.7 in the 1950s, and you see that it has been maintained constant for longer, and the decline, though it has happened, has started later. And what Carl has shown you is that maybe that 4.5 is too optimistic, because many countries didn't have very recent data, and some of the data that is coming out is showing a stall in the fertility decline that hasn't come down that much. So even that present time may be optimistic. Now, what do we want them to do in order to get the medium variant? These are the assumptions that the medium variant has inside it to get to the 9.3 billion in 2050 and 10.1 in 2100. The low fertility countries, their fertility is projected to go up so that they don't disappear too quickly. So they remain below replacement fertility all the time, but their average fertility goes up from 1.6 to 1.9 in the next 90 years. So we hope that that's feasible, but maybe not. Maybe they'll disappear more quickly. The intermediate fertility countries start with 2.4. They're very close to replacement level. That tends to be around 2.1. They go below replacement level. They almost match the low fertility countries for most of the century, and then they are even below the 1.9 at the end of the period. The high fertility countries is where I think most of the action is, and they start with 4.5 children per woman now. They need to go to 2.8 in 2050, and reach about replacement level at the end of the century. So it's a very slow decline compared to everyone else. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to have a higher population. So this is a graph I like because what it's showing you is how many millions each group of countries is adding every year to the world population. So if you see, up to now, the biggest addition has been given by the intermediate fertility countries, the group of countries that have fertility that is relatively moderate and that include India in there. The high fertility countries, however, have been growing. Its contribution to annual growth has been growing very much and is very soon likely to surpass the contribution of the intermediate fertility countries. And of course, the low fertility countries are going downhill, and you see that by 2050 they will be contributing to shrink the population and not to increase it. Because this shrinkage is going to take some time to happen. It's not happening at the group level too soon. So the important thing is to make sure that the high fertility countries follow that path, that they get a highest contribution around the middle of the century, and then they start declining. Because if their fertility is a little bit higher, they will continue to have increases in their annual growth. And as Carl says, we have a projection variant that keeps their fertility constant and their mortality constant as of today. And I like to cite it because in that projection variant, those countries add, at the end of the century, 1 billion people every 4 years. So that shows you that whatever they have as fertility and mortality today is just not sustainable. They cannot maintain it because they would grow too rapidly. So here are the numbers of the fertility that would produce that change in the fertility change that would produce that change in the annual growth, from 4.9 to 2.8 children per woman in 2050, and eventually to 2.1. So now what's happening to those countries? This is a graph that shows you the percentage of women who are using modern contraceptives according to the number of children they have. And the points have been coded. The green ones are the low fertility countries, the yellow ones are the intermediate fertility countries, and the red ones are the high fertility countries. And you see that both the low and the intermediate, there's a lot of variation of the level of modern contraceptive use that leads you to low fertility. And that's because, as Carl said, it depends how women use their methods, what efficiency they have, and also on the number of children depend on other variables like the level of abortion, that when people marry, when they actually have sex, etc., that are not related only to contraceptive use. But in general, high contraceptive use, at least 50% of married women using, is correlated with low fertility. And you see that the high fertility countries tend to have very low levels of modern contraceptive use. At the same time, we have data on something that we call the unmet need for contraception. And what these data represent is the percentage of married women who are asked who are married, they're sexually active, and they're not sterile, and they're asked whether they want to have a child immediately or whether, if they're pregnant, if they wanted to have that pregnancy. If they say no, then they check whether, well, with the ones that are pregnant, it doesn't matter, but with the other ones, whether they're using contraception. So the ones that say they don't want to get pregnant immediately or didn't want to get pregnant now and who were not using contraception are considered to have an unmet need for contraception. And you see again that there's unmet need at every level of fertility. The x-axis is the fertility. Even for the low fertility and intermediate fertility countries, there's about 10 or 20% of unmet needs for contraception. But the unmet need for contraception is especially high in the high fertility countries. That means that there seems to be a possible market for people that want to use contraception and that may not be getting it because the services are not available. Now we go back to the regions as we know them, and the important thing of this graph is to see that contraceptive prevalence, the general contraceptive prevalence, not just the use of modern contraceptives, has been growing in almost every region. The highest contraceptive prevalence is in East Asia at around 84% today among married women. It's the second bar, that is for 2010. In Southern Asia, the use of contraception has grown quite importantly in the last 2 decades. In Africa, the increase has also been important, but still too slow, and Africa has an extremely low level of modern contraceptive use at only a quarter of married women using. So no wonder, and I don't make a big point of Oceania, that's only developing Oceania, but Oceania also has a problem with high levels of population growth, except that being small islands, you did not see them very much in the map. Now, unmet need is the mirror image. You find that the unmet need is highest in sub-Saharan Africa and Oceania. It's not enormous. It's only about a quarter of the women, like a quarter of the women or a third of the women were using contraception, but another quarter of the married women would want to seem to be a possible market for contraception. So now the problem is that if you take the levels of unmet need for each country, now you have each of the countries for which we have the story. And I calculate how rapidly contraceptive prevalence has been increasing in the last 2 decades. And you take the level of an unmet need that exists today, and you figure out how many years it will take them at that speed to get rid of that unmet need. You find the number of years for a lot of these poor countries that have high fertility would be very long, 40 years. Some of them is 80 years, 100 years, because the increase in contraceptive prevalence has been so small. And notice that the problem is especially acute in West Africa, where the increase in contraceptive prevalence has been especially slow. But it tends to be higher in East Africa. The only place where the contraceptive prevalence, the unmet need would be met rather quickly would be in the few countries of Latin America that are high fertility countries. So someone has taken our data. When we make the projections, the population division makes the projections, it only looks at fertility and mortality. It doesn't take into account at all what's happening to contraceptive prevalence. So there's another group called the Futures Group that has used our projections, not the latest version, but the previous one, and tried to figure out a posteriori how much the contraceptive prevalence should have to increase, or how rapidly it should have increased in order to get to the medium variant of the projections. And what this shows you is that, as I showed before, the orange bars are the number of years that it would take to satisfy the unmet need in these regions according to the pace in which contraceptive prevalence has actually been increasing. So in Africa, it would take 50 years. In India, it would take more than 50 years. In Asia and North Africa, around 20 years. And according to the simulations made by the Futures Group, in order to get to the medium variant, the speed of acceptance of contraception has to be increased by double, and so that the time is cut in half. Otherwise, we won't meet the medium variant. That means these countries are going to grow a lot faster than the medium variant. It might be more close to the high variant, and they could add several more billions to the world by 2050, certainly by 2100. So now this map is one we like very much because it shows all these countries that look greenish are the countries where the donor spending in family planning since the 1996 has declined by more than 50%. So you see that part of the possible cause of the slow uptake of family planning, especially in the poor countries, is that certainly the countries themselves have not been investing a lot in family planning, but the donor community has also reduced the per capita spending on family planning, partly because the whole spending on reproductive health has increased. A lot of it had gone to HIV/AIDS. Now, to change topics, they had asked me to talk about how it was important to do things for society to make sure that these projections happen. I submit to you that providing family planning for the women who need it is a way of empowering women. That is an intrinsic part of giving them better options for life. It might allow them to stay in school and not get pregnant very early. It might allow them also to find better jobs because they can plan when they're having their children. There's good evidence that as more people plan their families, the labor force of women is liberated for better use in the economy. But another thing that always comes up is the idea that without better education for women, you won't get any changes. Now, I put together some data on the education of women. This is the most basic data on the percent of women who are literate, who know how to read and write. And you see that for most regions, Latin America, East Asia, and the Pacific, the Middle East, especially the green bars that are showing the proportion of women who are literate among the young women, the 15 to 24, are relatively high, about 80%. But once you come to South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, these regions are not doing very well. The very young women, barely 60%, 70% are literate in the most recent period in 2009. And in Africa, the increase has not been that huge. It was bigger in South Asia. And if you take the whole set of women, 15 to 49, in fact 15 plus, you find that the level of literacy is pretty poor in Sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, certainly not comparable to what has happened in Latin America and East Asia. So one of the points I make is that if one is going to wait till one educates, makes these people read, to give them the services they need in order to plan their families, we're going to have reached the high variant or maybe higher, because you see how slowly the change has taken place in the past. Now, I've decided to also show what are the consequences of higher population growth on the number of children that need to be educated. These are the projected number of pupils in primary education just for Sub-Saharan Africa. And there I'm using the medium variant and the high variant. And there's another assumption. It's not just a change in numbers of children that is making a difference there, but a change in the enrollment rate in the population. In both cases, the enrollment rate at this moment in Sub-Saharan Africa, 75% of all children attend primary school, and I'm getting it up to 97% of the children. And you see that as time goes on, the difference between those curves is rather important. It's higher than 50 million children at the end of the period. And every one of these millions of children you add is adding costs to the population to keep up with the enrollment of children in the education system. One can also calculate how much it would demand of new teachers to be trained, not only to match the population of children they're having, which are the low curves. The white one is the medium variant, the green one is the high variant. But at this moment in Sub-Saharan Africa, they have the average of 47 pupils in primary school per teacher. In Latin America, they have about 27 per teacher. So the next curves is what you would need to increase the next two curves. You would need to increase the number of teachers to get to the level of Latin America. And the last two lines are the ones where you would increase the number of teachers to get to the level that the developed countries have today, about 20 children per teacher. And you see that if you want to really get to better quality education, and the last thing, you might have to increase the number of teachers by almost 10 million in the medium variant or 12 million in the high variant. So it's a big demand that you're putting in the system of education, depending on how many children you have, and depending also on whether you want to improve the services or not. So to me, it is clear and important that the world, especially for the high fertility countries, tries to reach, at the very least, the medium variant projection of the United Nations. That would not only make the United Nations be fabulous in terms of projecting the population, but I think it would also imply something good for the world. But in order to do that, providing people the means to plan their families is essential, and it would have the added benefits of reducing the costs of getting those people better health, as I'm sure my colleague is going to tell you, and better education. So thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff. Okay. Okay. Thank you. As Jeff switches that, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, ESCP program, and thanks, people, for coming. I wondered when I was asked what I could possibly add to what these two people will say about projections. So, truth in advertising, I'm not going to add anything to projections. They know more than I ever will about population projections. And what I will add to it, and I guess maybe just to sort of broaden out the discussion a little bit, because I know people here do know a lot about these issues, I'm going to add some thinking from the economic side. Because I have been quite involved over the years in looking at how population and reproductive health and family planning may affect economic outcomes. And so I'll add economics to this rich stew of demographics, and people here know that economics and demography are very close sister disciplines, and like sisters, we don't always agree. Sometimes there's a little bit of squabbling, but because I'm outnumbered, there won't be any squabbling here today. I'll just try to kind of point out some of the places where population and the projections that we've heard about might inform us in thinking about economic outcomes. And sort of maybe give a little bit of explanation of what we know about that, the why of some of this and the how of some of this. This comes largely from work that has been done not directly by me, so I can't take credit for it, but within a program of research that I have had a hand in coordinating, funded by a number of research organizations and primarily focused on Africa, understanding how population and reproductive health in Africa will or can affect economic outcomes, both the household level and at the national level, at the macroeconomic level. And that's the Population and Poverty Research Network, supported by the Hewlett Foundation and 4 European scientific funders. So that's mainly what I'm going to talk about and give a couple of examples of some of the results, but try to give a feel for these sorts of interactions and feedback loops and so on that do happen. So one of the reasons why the Hewlett Foundation and others decided to fund this program of research wasn't really because we lacked some ideas and some research about economic demography and about demography and economic conditions, but because we really weren't sure about some very fundamental questions having to do with those relationships, mainly because the data and the methods that we had been using for a long time didn't answer questions where there was sort of causality issues. That is, what causes what? In what direction can we expect these relationships and linkages to have effects? And so a lot of that is still not answered completely, but I think we've made some headway. We know that things like improvements in reproductive health, reductions in fertility, and economic growth occur together. So our big challenge was, how do we sort of disentangle those and understand, if you pull a policy lever or if you're designing a program in population and reproductive health or family planning, how might you have increase your chances of having certain economic outcomes occur. And I think one of the bottom lines that we can say very clearly in some of the examples we've heard about show us that, and have shown us that for years, that you can have these sorts of improvements in health even in very poor countries. So the causality, while there are lots of ways in which there's two-way causality, we don't have to expect that economic growth is going to precede these improvements in health or these declines in TFR, declines in population growth. That's very clear to us, and I'll give some examples later on. So I will focus on fertility and mortality by and large, not on the migration side of population change, and talk about how, let's see, I think I have even a slide that tells what I'm supposed to talk about here, if I pay attention to my slides. So understanding a little bit more about what drives fertility. There will be some focus on fertility, as we've already had, looking a little bit at the demand side and supply side factors. That's in economic speak, a way of saying that we know that these changes are linked and intertwined, and we're trying to disentangle them somewhat, this bidirectional role that development has in all of this. And then we'll get to some of the policies. In the interest of time, and I know that are we supposed to finish at 2? Oh, good. Okay, well, we have a little time then. Then I will try not to hurry too much. Maybe point out just some of the things that I think about in terms of assumptions that we should be thinking more about, and some of the new questions that I think are interesting, and then some of the results and where we're going with this continuing research program. So demand and supply side factors, as I mentioned. Again, economists tend to think in these terms. We know that they are not completely separate, but just to sort of get us on the page together, what the things that we're thinking about in looking at population and economic development. The demand side, by that I mean, how do we get from families that we've been hearing about in countries of different ages to decision-making about fertility, childbearing, and all of the things that sort of are that follow on to that. So we know that income levels, we know that education levels, the opportunity costs by that, what parents and women in particular might do instead of bearing children or raising children, how those choices come into play, knowledge and beliefs, obviously, life expectancy, what you are anticipating for yourself as well as for your children. These are sort of headline ones that we're all pretty familiar with that feed into decision making and feed into outcomes, even if we can't trace all of those in every case very clearly. On the supply side, that does have to do more with the technologies, the access to technologies, what the health system does. And it's fairly clear, looking over a lot of different examples, that the ability for a health system to function, for women and children to get basic health care through a generally publicly provided health system set of interventions and packages is really key. It drives an awful lot of things, even if it's not directly defined as a program of antenatal care, for instance. The overall capacity in the health system and the types of resources that it needs are really critical to effective delivering effective access and services and so on. And then, of course, technology and how technology changes and investments in technology. There's probably some things I've left off of both of those lists, but the main point is sort of what the arrows show us, and that's kind of what we've been trying to work on, as I said, is sort of sorting out a lot of this stuff. So if we're thinking about programming and we're thinking about how policies may affect these outcomes, it's useful to sort of understand the whole. Let's see, I don't want to go to that yet because that's going to hold on. Useful to understand the realm that we're talking about in terms of the economic types of outcomes. So I'm going to sort of list off 4 main categories of economic outcomes that we've been looking at that affect families and individuals in ways that interact with these factors, and then later on get into a little bit more of what we've learned about these. So from investments in family planning and reproductive health, we know that women's and children's health can improve. As I said, we have not gotten over the years as much clarity as we would like from the data that we've had, to be able to generalize as much as we would like in some of these ways, some of these relationships. And so that's why this program has, and I think what we've learned in doing it, has stressed looking in situ, as it were, looking at countries and populations in the specific settings and understanding as much as we can about context. I think that's, it's echoing to some extent what you've already heard from the other speakers, but I want to make sure that, even if I talk about sort of broad relationships, it turns out that those relationships can vary quite a lot from country to country and even within a country in terms of the different populations. But in general, the kinds of things that we've looked at, improved control of fertility and improved women's and children's health, change women's opportunities to invest their time in acquiring skills and in investing time in the labor market, and that affects their earnings. And it affects not only their earnings, but their what is generally called empowerment, their ability to control resources and to make decisions within the household. So that's one of the sort of areas of, so let's see if I can, if I have, well, I don't know if there's I guess that's number 2 here. I don't think I've ordered my comments as well as I should have. But so women's economic opportunities, of course, derive from the improved health and the improved control of fertility. Secondly, changes in lifetime fertility may motivate parents to accumulate more physical assets over time. That is, there's to some extent choices that parents make between acquiring physical assets versus acquiring children or investing in children. And sometimes those can be seen as substitutes in an economic relationship. So this is this one here, smaller family size or choices about family size. It's to some extent the sort of age-old quality-quantity trade-off thing, although that in itself is a bit of a overgeneralization. But smaller family size definitely can affect capital accumulation, that is asset accumulation within the family as substitutes for children. And I say this again with the condition that there are an awful lot of ifs and buts that surround this. Thirdly, the human capital investments that parents can make in each of their children can, of course, affect other kinds of outcomes. And that goes back up here in my non-ordered list to changes in cohort sizes. What are the implications for crowding, the kinds of things that were hinted at in the earlier discussion about just how large those age cohorts are and what that implies for population growth, but also what that implies for demand on economic resources, demand on environmental resources, and other sorts of resources within a country and in the world. And, of course, there are also related to that those health improvements that I mentioned at the beginning. And then lastly, the general equilibrium effects, what economists call general equilibrium effects, which are that there's a lot of sort of knock-on effects of each of these kinds of things. For instance, the change in the labor force that I alluded to a few minutes ago, women's fertility change or women and men's fertility choices will have some outcomes in terms of household sizes and numbers of children that women are caring for, and that will have some outcomes in terms of women's opportunity costs, the decisions about employment and so on, and that will have effects on the labor force itself, but more specifically, what can we measure about that? What we tend to measure is the labor productivity and wages that emerge from those family size choices and women's opportunity cost. Greater disposable income if there is not as much money spent on raising children, then you have income available for other things, and that has effects on consumption of other things. Okay, you may consume, again, simplistically put, you may consume children, or you may consume other things, not literally, but that does affect consumption as economists measure it. And then, of course, these kinds of things, the investments in other types of assets, the improved labor productivity, the higher consumption, those things all add up to what we measured generally as higher economic growth. So those are some of the key pathways that we've been trying to measure and understand. And again, they all are pretty complicated. So in some, looking at mortality decline stimulates these improvements in health that were mentioned earlier and that I've just mentioned, both child health and related improvements in adult health, particularly in women's health, but even more broadly within the household. Health is a form of human capital that affects productivity and then these other kinds of decisions. And the productivity and better health relate to longer lifespans, lead to generally longer lifespans, and then that leads to choices about how families invest resources in education and in financial savings and so on. So that's sort of one major pathway of these effects, the linkages that we're talking about on the mortality change side. And then when you roll in fertility change, that other part of the demographic transition, if you will, then that has very direct effects on women's choices along the lines of what I've mentioned. So those things are what we're talking about. Okay, specifically moving forward beyond sort of all of these different sorts of interesting economic outcomes, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of interventions and policies that seem to be most relevant to try to drive in a positive way, in a productive way, these sorts of economic outcomes that we've mentioned. And in so doing, I kind of want to just raise a few questions that I thought of as I was, putting together some results to present to you. I mean, one is the quality-quantity trade-off thing that I've mentioned as a driver of total fertility rate, that, this sort of long-standing but fairly simplistic notion that parents make a choice between numbers of children versus investing more in each child. And it really, I think probably a lot of people in the room realize and know from direct experience that it's really much more complicated than that. And we need to understand more about what's going on within that household decision-making unit, primarily amongst partners, about those choices and what can influence those choices, the kinds of external effects that Hanya was pointing to in terms of educational opportunities and many others that we could talk about that affect that decision-making. So that trade-off notion I find to be not very useful, frankly. Secondly, I think the idea, and there's much discussion, good stuff has been written about unmet need and, what we understand about it. I guess, as a non-demographer, what I take away from my understanding of that situation, again, what Hanya was showing us is, how many years would it take to be able to reduce unmet need to where we would need to. I would like to see us get more sophisticated about, I guess, not just a focus on the supply side, but much more focus on what an economist would call the demand side. And, not just what does unmet need mean, because I know we there's lots of good discussion about it, and it's what we have and what's measured. But, how do we understand what could bring about faster change, I guess, to put it very simply, and again, as Hanya pointed to. So that's my first question here, how to employ policy levers with a better understanding of both demand and supply sides, but especially demand and how to influence it. I think that's probably on everybody's mind to a great extent. And then the broader one that is, again, part of the continuing research program that we have, how to understand the role of population in macroeconomic development. For quite a long time, I think there's been, and I wish we could solve it right here and now, but we're not there yet, a lot of camps on this, that lower population drives faster economic growth. There are camps that say it's really neutral, and there are camps that say the opposite, that higher population will drive economic growth. And on the latter, a number of those camps are in very important decision-making roles in countries in Africa. And so it's important to take that view seriously. So moving on to some of what we've learned and in this research program, largely focused on Africa at the micro level. So here we're looking a lot at families, at spousal units, and at women's choices by and large. And there's just an awful lot of studies, and I can't begin to sort of do justice to all of the different questions that have been studied in this program, nor the full set of results. I just pulled out a few that I thought were relevant for our discussion here. We've had studies by and large using longitudinal data and some experimental studies. It's not very feasible to be using cross-sectional data, cross-country studies to answer these kinds of questions, because to get into the causality question, to try to really understand the direction and magnitude of those arrows, you have to have adequate data to do that. And that's why we haven't really been able to answer these questions with very great certainty in the past. So the most well-known, and I think really the only ones that are especially applicable here, long-term studies looking at how population family planning influences economic outcomes at a household level are MATLAB and Navrongo, and I'm sure most people in the room are pretty familiar with those, MATLAB in Bangladesh and Navrongo in Ghana. And they both have told us in different ways that maternal and child health programs, family planning specifically, but really in both cases broader programs, have produced very significant welfare benefits for women and children, and they're very rich sources of information for us. There are a lot of things we don't yet know from them, and I'm not here to go into too much detail about either of those, but we are beginning to have some other places where we can look with good longitudinal data at some of these questions. It's just that those ones were there from a long time ago, and very good, purposeful research that gave us some answers to things like, if you invest this much in family planning or invest this much in a broader family health program, what kind of results in terms of women's employment, in terms of wages, in terms of education, child health, etc. Those sorts of broad questions have been able to be answered by that. Other things we've looked at with more experimental studies, for instance, intra-household decision-making and gender roles. And that's some work. There are others, but I just pulled out Erica Field has done some work looking at family planning with an interesting experiment where women are offered family planning where the husbands don't have any knowledge of women being offered access to contraceptives, and found very interestingly that when women did not share, there were two different groups. One group where the women and their partners, their husband, they were married, so wives and husbands were offered the family planning, better access to family planning together, and a group where they were not, where the women were offered the better access to family planning without their husbands being aware of it. And the results tell us that there's a very different decision that happens. The women were much more likely to visit a family planning nurse and much more likely to receive a form of contraception, and much more likely to have less likely to have an unwanted birth, 57% reduction in unwanted birth amongst those women whose husbands were not involved in having access to the program. Pretty startling result, and there is some ongoing work to see if that's replicated elsewhere. I guess this is a good point to emphasize that, again, studying these things in situ is really important, because this was a small experimental study, and this kind of thing result could just not emerge in a different kind of a setting. Elizabeth Frankenberg and Duncan Thomas did some work focusing on women's access to assets within the family, again, trying to understand different choices that are made by partners about their investments, and they, in this case, looked primarily at Indonesia and showed that when women have greater control over resources within the family, and this is something that we've seen many examples of this, but they were specifically looking at certain type of ownership of assets, gold in particular, women's jewelry, and their gold that tends to be a way that people hold important family assets in some countries, that having gold that is owned by the women, it's theirs to control, predicts smaller reductions in spending under circumstances of strife, in this case a natural disaster in Indonesia, predicts smaller reductions in spending on health and education, consistent with other findings of researchers that show that females allocate more resources to investment in children, even under these conditions that were very, very difficult for the family's survival. So that's another example that comes out on the micro side. There's a lot more that has to be and is being investigated in terms of the household decision making. Alan Hill and Ernest Arieti and people in Ghana with the Women's Health Study, the Ghana Women's Health Study, have really broken a lot of new ground understanding the relationship between women's health and what is happening with their children, as well as what women's choices in terms of labor market. One interesting result of that is that women are very attached to the labor market, and even those women that have higher fertility are still very involved in the labor market, although it does seem to so the short run seems to suggest that women don't leave the labor market even a little bit during their pregnancies, but they come right back after their pregnancies, after giving birth. In the long run, it appears to be different, in that in the long run, women with higher numbers of children within the families still have lower labor supply. And if there's time, I can give an example later on from Tanzania. This one was Ghana and Tanzania. It looks like we're seeing perhaps a different result there, depending on the age, or if you will, perhaps the generation of the woman. That is, that older generation women seem to be less attached to the labor market after they've had a certain number of children, whereas younger generation women don't seem to be showing that effect with the same number of children. So that there may be some generational change happening there over time, but we can maybe get back into some of those details. At the macro level, we've got some even greater challenges trying to figure out the relationships between family planning and reproductive health policies and programs and what the economic outcomes are. We know that mortality changes are very different across different settings, particularly in urban and rural areas. And so that clearly, as I alluded to at the beginning, mortality change and the effects that it has on a number of outcomes is really key. So understanding what's happening with mortality at different ages, both infant and child as well as at older ages, is important. And has effects in the case, this first bulletin point is suggesting different effects in rural and urban areas on not just fertility but on migration. Going on, there's of course the sort of the demographic dividend, the now famous demographic dividend, where we know that when there's a transition taking place as the numbers of young people fertility decline happens and the numbers of very young people drop, yet there's still a lot of people moving into the labor force. We expect to have sort of a surge in economic productivity, economic outcome happening from that transition in age structure. So a lower youth dependency rate is expected to raise national income per capita. That's the idea behind the demographic dividend. Because of the larger share of the working age population. But there's an awful lot of caveats to that, an awful lot of buts. And I don't want to get too much into all the details of that, although we can talk about it more in the discussion. But among the assumptions that we have to make, or the observations that we have to make in specific contexts, is what happens to female labor force participation as that fertility decline happens. And as I just was suggesting, it can vary quite a bit from different places, from place to place. So we need to understand that more. We also need to understand, of course, what the economic context is, as well as the educational context for those young people and new entrants into the labor force. What are they exposed to? What are their opportunities? And again, as Hanya suggested earlier, if you don't have the capacity in the educational system, even more if you don't have the capacity in the labor force, the demand for those new entrants in the labor force, you certainly can't expect to have that age structure change produce greater economic growth. And that seems to have been one of the major problems in Africa, and as contrasted to other parts of the world where we've seen that demographic dividend play out into some much more beneficial economic growth. So we have a lot of feedback things that can happen here in terms of what I was telling you about earlier, where if you have a fertility decline and then you have some substitution where parents are investing in financial resources instead of, for instance, in higher numbers of children, those financial resources turn into economic savings in an economy. Those can be accessed to build greater capacity in the private sector, in the industrial sector, in the work sector, in the education sector, and so on. So there's an awful lot of feedback loops here that can be beneficial, or they can not be if you don't have, again, the conditions that allow for the positive feedbacks to take place. And just looking to see if there's a few more things that I want to say about that before going on to the next bullet point. As the chart here says, these are some of the feedbacks that can happen if you're very, very low fertility already. Then you're going to need to be thinking about the old age dependency rate. So it can happen that you move quickly from a high child dependency to quickly, in certain terms, to a higher old age dependency rate, and that needs to be considered. And as we've heard earlier speakers say, there are countries that are concerned about that. More likely, it really is more of an issue about what happens in the labor market with women, with new entrants into the labor market, and how that affects wages and, of course, other opportunities. I mentioned the feedback. And finally, some work that has been done that's been a little bit cause for caution on this demographic dividend to some extent, or on the broader question of macroeconomic growth resulting from declining fertility or declining population. David Weil and a number of his colleagues have been modeling long-term effects of lower fertility rates and not seeing, even in a long-term setting, not seeing much greater economic growth emerging. Their supposition is that it's simply that there's a very long lag time, and after a while, after that lag time occurs, you see very, very small effects emerging because they can't pick up from the data greater effects. It's a sort of a long-standing issue in the economics of studying this, that we see some pretty substantial effects on the micro side, households and individuals doing things that lead to, and this is what MATLAB and Navrongo and other studies have shown us, that lead to some pretty big economic outcomes. We can't seem to detect it very well at the macro side, and that's what Weil's work so far has shown us. Finally, where would we want to concentrate interventions? That we need to have those complementary investments in education and health, I think, is kind of obvious to most of us, that population policy doesn't stand alone, and I think in a number of ways we've suggested the need for a fuller package, as was done, for instance, in MATLAB. That there's very good reason to prioritize poor and marginalized populations to reach out and get very significant change in those populations. Has a very big effect on the broader overall national effects. And the use of more evidence-based programs and service delivery programs, what do we know and what are we pretty sure of? And I guess I'll sort of close with where we are with the research agenda. Shireen Joshi and I have written a paper that's not yet published. It'll be published later on this year by CGD, where we looked at a group of 60 countries back in 1970 that had high TFR, high fertility. And what we did was look at what had happened to them over the course of 30 years. And we were able to pretty clearly define two groups of countries, what we call the high and the high-low. The high being countries that started with high fertility and continued to have pretty high fertility even 30 years later. And the group that started with high fertility and achieved pretty low fertility, or what we would call not very low, but low fertility 30 years later. And we compared them on a whole variety of factors, such as female education and such as different kinds of health conditions and so on. And what we found essentially was that, well, there are many correlations that you can make, and we weren't trying to assess causality here. But we wanted to look very broadly to see what those correlations, what kind of patterns we could detect in those correlations. So fertility decline can happen across a wide range of conditions. As I said at the outset, it doesn't require fast economic growth in order to happen. And that was very clear in our high-low countries. A number of them did not achieve economic growth during that time period, and yet did achieve lower fertility. Vietnam and Bangladesh being two examples. So some of the unsurprising results were when we looked at factors like contraceptive prevalence rate, age at marriage, age at sexual debut. Those are all important. But they weren't the only things that could help contribute to a lower TFR. Things like infant and child mortality, education levels, urbanicity, those varied quite widely. And so our conclusions are essentially this, that investments in public health and education were essential. The investments in female education particularly important, although again, not a perfect correlation there. Focus on the marginalized and poor, for instance, especially in Brazil and Iran, where you could see that achieved a very great gain when they were focused on those members of the population. In particular, it's important to have free services available in public facilities for that to work, and the evidence-based program that I mentioned that drives policy design and program design. The POV program has just finished a review of new proposals. There will be new research funded primarily in two areas. One, to continue to work on this macroeconomic relationship that still is very, very confusing. And another to work on female empowerment and the gender issues and the relationships within the family and what affects that and how decision making occurs and so on. So there will be new research in those areas coming out. And then lastly, I left out front for people to pick up who are interested in the research side of all of this, a call for papers for the next meeting of the POV network, which occurs every year in January. The next meeting will be in Oslo, and they're looking for paper submissions now. It's quite a nice network of researchers, international network of researchers that are doing work on these connections. And if you're interested, there's a website that is here. Oops, for the research here. And all of these studies and conclusions and results and announcements and so on are on that website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Okay, let's jump right into questions. As I mentioned before, my colleagues will bring you a microphone. I think what we'll do is we'll take a number of them and then give you guys an opportunity to divide and conquer among all of you. Who would like to start? We can start with Kara, Rob. After that, Ed. Okay.
Thank you for a wonderful set of presentations. My question is directed at Carl and Hania. I'm from the World Wildlife Fund, and I frequently get questions from my colleagues about the assumptions you make for the UN projections, because my colleagues widely make the assumption that we will be going towards the median projection. And one of the questions I get a lot and I can't really answer is, to what degree do you take into account the potential for increasing mortality based on widespread population growth and associated disasters, health impacts, and that sort of thing, or do you not take that into account at all?
Go straight back. Yeah. We'll take a couple here because I think they're often related. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to ask that too, but the other question I had was for the demographers. Can you tell us how Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa as a region, how the fertility decline there compares to other regions over several decades at the same stage of the demographic transition? In other words, is TFR falling in Africa much slower than it did in East Asia, South Asia, or Latin America at the same stage of the demographic transition.
Okay, Kate, why don't we come back up here? We'll do this side, and then we'll do another one with this side.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Ellen Smith. I'm a demographer with the Futures Group. Together with Scott Moreland, we authored the paper that Hania mentioned about unmet need, and I wanted to mention two things. First, I just wanted to mention that we're updating the paper to take into account the new UN projections and also the new definition of unmet need. And secondly, I was hoping, Hania, that you could just talk a little bit about, we've all seen here that the future path of TFR is sort of the big question mark in population projections. So if you could just speak a little bit about how the UN forecasts the TFR, and especially the new methodology with the probabilistic projections from the last round, and also why the decision has been made to make the UN the low and high variance, 0.5 lower and higher than the medium variant.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Liz, why don't you hold on to the microphone to be the first, and then we'll get Ed in the next one. So why don't we take those three? If you can just hand it next to you there. Liz will start the next round.
So it's mostly me. Okay. The mortality. We are very optimistic. Almost all our projections assume declining mortality for all countries, including the ones affected by HIV/AIDS. There's no way in the world that we can project or predict disasters, so they don't exist. And the only thing that you may want to use as a basis for comparison, we have two scenarios. One in which we keep mortality constant as of today, with fertility changing with the medium variant. That's the constant mortality scenario. And there's another one where both of them are kept constant. So that would be the sort of pessimistic view that mortality doesn't change in countries, so that you can see somewhat the effect that declining mortality has on different countries. Now, why is it that we don't project increasing mortality? Because it hasn't happened in most places. You have little spikes of mortality when there's a disaster, and even there, they're very temporary. The way the projections are done in the population division is they are done contrary to what the Census Bureau has, is that we operate with 5-year periods. So over 5-year periods, even bad disasters, unless it was the killing in Rwanda, don't increase mortality a lot, because in the other places they decline. So you mostly have been seeing declines in mortality. The main exception of some stalling and increases is the Russian Federation, where, again, I think our projections try to project a relatively slow decline, but we still project a slow decline. So that would be one of the reasons that I didn't mention of why our projections may fail, that if really some countries get to unsustainable levels of whatever, mortality may go up, and that's not taken into account in the projections. Now, the other question about how did Africa do at the same stage of the demographic transition? Unfortunately, it's not as if the demographic transition had a perfect script, and that's what my colleague Rachel was telling you. It's not clear at what we know that in most countries, child mortality declines first and then fertility. But that's not in all countries, and you cannot tell exactly how much decline you need to have before fertility declines. The decline can be in some places 20% and in others 80%, and fertility, in the 80% fertility has still not changed. So there's no rule by which you change mortality and then you change fertility. But everything that we've seen, and Carl's slide showed it very well, is that many African countries have had high fertility for much longer than one expected. Though from the very beginning, the reason the UN projections in 82 were not wrong is that the UN analysts had always thought that Africa was going to lag behind in general compared to other countries. So that the fertility transition would start, the declining fertility would start later, and that sometimes we thought it might not be so fast. But depending on the projection, sometimes it's made fast and some not fast. And that takes me to your question about how fertility is projected now. The 2010 revision really made a huge change in the projection of fertility in the medium variant. Because before, you have to also know that the United Nations produces projections every 2 years, and over the last 10 years, every 2 years, the methodology for producing fertility projections has been tweaked in different ways and changed in different ways. So the previous one, in 2008, the projections of fertility were made for all countries in the world, all countries with fertility above replacement level, by having 3 models of change. So the analysts had to choose, is it a fast change, as an intermediate change, or a slow change? And once they chose it, the program gives you a path. So they only had a choice of 3 paths. What was done in the 2010 revision is a totally new thing, is that by using the same model, it was a logistic model of change, they fitted to all the experience of past fertility change from high to low fertility in every country of the world, including the Africans that had moved rather slowly. And with a probabilistic model, they used that to project the paths for every country by running the dice. So it was like a Monte Carlo experiment for every country, where 100,000 paths were generated for every country, and whatever was the central path was used as the median path. So that's where the probability entered in. But then we decided that we were not going to produce as the normal projections the real probabilistic paths, partly because my colleagues were running out of time, and partly because in order to tell the story to any of you, if I tell you that the 95% interval for Nigeria is like 100 million difference in 200 and 2100, it's not easy to absorb. So it's much easier to tell people if fertility is just half a child above, and that's not a lot, because you saw the variation of fertility today. We go from anywhere from 1 child to 9 or 8, okay? So a difference of just half a child makes a huge difference in where you end up in the fertility, in the population at the end. So we decided that that's still a very useful interval to use for information purposes. However, if you go to the website of the Population Division, you will find that for every country, they have now posted the graphs of the real probabilistic projections for every country of the world. And what seems to be happening is that for countries that have high fertility, the ones I like, the red ones, the probabilistic projections are a lot wider than the half-child minus half-child difference. That means that it's possible, not likely, that the real happenings in those countries could be outside of the half-child difference. That means the potential for possible growth, or maybe decline, but I would say growth, is higher probably than what we're saying.
I could just ask, just add on that question you asked about rising mortality. And people do, they'll look at our wall chart and they'll say, how can you possibly project 100 million people for Uganda? And when they call up sometimes like that, they're a little hot under the collar. And so I'll say something sometimes, let's imagine that half the population of the United States moves to Arkansas tomorrow. Why did I say that? Because Bangladesh is the size of Arkansas. And what we notice is the very sharp drop in fertility that occurred in Bangladesh since the early 1990s without economic growth. Now I have not worked there. I've worked in India, but not there. And it's been explained to me simply that they ran out of land. So there will come a point in which the seams will start to burst. And I think that may be the thing that brings down fertility in some countries. Maybe not as Zambia, which is quite large. Again, if you live in Arkansas, you want 150 million new neighbors, I think you do something about it, and I think they probably will. So that's all. Oh, I did want to say quickly one other thing. You're talking about literacy. In literacy, we have to get over thinking of things like middle class and literacy in our own terms. Literacy in most censuses in developing countries is not comparable at all. You can probably believe literate percentages in Costa Rica, but not in India. It's frequently collected in a census where someone will say, oh yes, so-and-so is literate, if they have had a few years of schooling. But many people in developing countries, once they leave school, they don't read. In villages, they don't read a lot, so they lose whatever literacy they might have gained. And you might ask, has anybody ever tested this? And say, yes, somebody has. There's a man, a professor at Ahmedabad University, Burj Kotari, has actually gone out in the field in some of the poorest countries of India, asked the census question, and then tested the people who were said to be literate if they could get their way through a 30-word paragraph without a lot of stumbling. And 1/4 could. So that's all. So we have to think in terms differently.
Okay, Liz, why don't we start with you?
My question, Liz Leahy-Madsen, also with Futures Group, primarily for Hania, though Carl, you may have thought about this as well. For the low fertility countries, the below replacement, especially for the sub 1.5, did you ever consider creating a mini variant or maybe just running the numbers to see what would happen if their fertility continued to decline, which seems just as likely perhaps as the assumption that it will reverse course and rise back up to replacement level?
Okay, and if we could go across to Ed in the middle. I don't know if we can, or other we had 2 microphones a minute ago. Oh, there we go.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Real quickly, just a reflection on the Planet Under Pressure conference, which made it very clear that humanity is overutilizing planetary resources dramatically. And thank you, Carl, for that finally a reference to something about resources in your last comment. But my question has to do with the perception, again, of these forecasts. The prevailing view of 5,000 scientists and policymakers at the Planet Under Pressure conference is that the UN median projection is destiny. It's going to happen. And there's nothing we can do about that growth. But the positive side is, don't worry, you can see it's flattening out, so we don't need to worry about population. I'm wondering what your suggestions might be for what we can do to try to correct some of these myths in terms of the view of it. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions before we turn it back? Because I think we're coming close. Yes, Kathleen, in the middle.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mogelgard, and thank you for the really informative presentations. My question is kind of a follow-on to Ed's. I've spent a lot of time trying to talk about population projections and explain them to the general public, and I think generally it's perceived among the general public that the medium population projection is an inevitability, or perhaps it's sort of a business as usual projection. And I wondered, I've often thought that it would be useful to have a projection that is somewhat based on potential policy interventions in the realm of population policy or some of the other aspects that you were talking about, Rachel, in terms of education and health improvements. And I just wondered from the perspective of the demographers if there are plans or hopes to have sort of a policy-based population projection developed in the future that could be used among those of us who are communicating this to the public.
Okay, why don't we give you all a final opportunity with reflections on those questions.
So, to answer my friend about the resources, well, at least under me and the population division, what we've tried to do is give you the tools to tell people what the uncertainty of the projections is. We haven't done a perfect job, but I think the fact that the 2010 revision goes to 2100 is really important. And why? Because after playing with numbers for at least 10 years, I'm afraid that because of momentum, this number to 2050 really is quite sticky. Besides, we already have half the population that is going to live there born. So where you start opening the realm of possibilities is by going into the future where you really don't know what's going to happen. And what is important to tell people, and the problem is that it's not easy to understand, is that depending on where we get to 2050 is what constraints we're going to have later. So that it's very important to get 2050 to 9 or less. And you could get to less. We have done, I think that if you look at the projections of the low variant, for many of the countries that are low fertility, they go down. We didn't make it in order for them to go down, but they go down, okay? Because if you see most of them, they are recovering their fertility, but at a very slow pace. They're adding 0.012 per quinquennium. So you look at the low, it's going to go down. And I'm not even sure that if, because of these probabilistic projections where people are not looking at the path, it's whatever comes out of the running of the 100,000 paths, and some of them go down. It may be that in some countries you have the medium that makes them go down before they go up. But I don't know. I haven't checked every path. So I think that it's important to probably play more with the numbers to see how you present the message, because I think these numbers are giving you a lot of possibilities of telling the story in a different way, and especially by focusing in the long-term future. But one of the things that, first of all, you're have in front of you the people that do the projections as you want them. There's the Futures group that has the famous RAPID program where you can put, in terms of scenarios, whatever your guess is about what might happen in terms of contraception, plans, programs, whatever, and you get some numbers. That is very important if you're talking to country by country, if your audience is a specific country that knows their case. Unfortunately for us in the population division, that doesn't make sense, because whatever other source of data we find has worse credibility and a shorter time trend than we have for the fertility, mortality, and population trends that we have. The best data we have are the data that are demographic. They have their problems, but they're the best. There's also a lot of biological consistency in those data. They cannot change, except for disasters. They cannot change very drastically. But as I tell you, even for disasters, I realize also that it's really very hard to kill a lot of people in a very short time. So if you think that you're going to control population growth by just an epidemic, it seems it's not quite likely, although, maybe we have a Spanish flu again, and half of the population dies, but it's not that easy. So, yeah, people hear about these things that, there are a lot of deaths here, but given the huge amount of population we already have, they don't make a dent. So I don't think that we're going to change our methods, or my colleagues are going to, because these have worked very well. And that's because there's this consistency in the thing. Now, what we can get as surprises is for specific countries, stalling or mortality, slight increases, stalling of fertility, or the drop, the big question. Carl pointed it. I didn't focus on it because I think it is a huge question, but I also know that if I keep everything constant as of today for the intermediate fertility countries, they're going to grow, but they don't explode too much. But if India doesn't go below replacement fertility, if Indonesia doesn't go below replacement fertility, if Brazil, we made a mistake and it's not below replacement, they're going to grow, and they're huge. So they also can add a lot of the population. And these are not yet developed countries. They're countries that are very poor still, and where the differences are huge. And I like very much what Carl said about, look at literacy. Okay, we have the data because they're part of the MDG, so now we have the data. And if you look at the data by country, there are lots of holes. And the trends are very strange. But okay, you have the data. What I find is that everyone tells me, and Rachel said it, you have to improve education, otherwise nothing changes in fertility. Well, if you wait to improve the education of women that still don't know how to read, we're cooked, because they'll keep on having 9 children for 3 generations before you make them read. And I don't think that that's what's happened. We've seen that women have an interest in not being pregnant every year. So if you manage to transmit the message properly and give them the means, a lot of them will use it at least to postpone births. And if at least they postpone them for a while, they might not get to have as many children as they would have had otherwise. And slowly the society changes. Hopefully one can expedite that change in the countries that are lagging behind.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of comments. One thing is fertility in Europe, for the most part, is going down now. So your projections may be down.
No, it's going up.
No, it's going down. 2011, it's 2011. Japan and Korea are, yeah. But a lot of European countries, the TFR has dropped in 2011.
Yes, because of the crisis, but it
exactly.
was going up
For
5, 6 years.
A little bit. But anyway.
Difference among our demographers, yes.
Anyway, it was going up in some, yeah, that's for sure. But they reversed the ones that were going up anyway. And the thing you raised too about how to maybe the best thing to do is if you're giving a presentation is to show the UN's constant fertility variant first, and scare people half to death, and then say, but if 117,000 things go right, this is what will happen. You know. We have a graph on our data sheet sometimes that shows years to add 1 billion. So the 7 billion was added in 12 years. And that could be the story for the 8th billion. And that gets people who think the growth has stopped. So anyway.
One last thought about Katie's question, which I think is a really good one. The demographic dividend thing, which I mentioned and people are familiar with, there's a lot of attachment to that among policy leadership, particularly in Africa. And I think it would be quite interesting to show some scenarios of what would need to be done on the kind of policy things that are readily changeable. I mean, not easy, but readily changeable, where we have good evidence, in order to achieve, that is, in order to get some benefits from that dividend. Because there's a certain sense, we know, I think, but there is still out there elsewhere a sense that it's inevitable, that it's sort of an automatic thing that happens, and that really has to be addressed. And in Uganda, for instance, where the whole population strategy right now is around achieving the demographic dividend, but without a concrete recipe about how to make that actually happen. So I think that that's a very interesting suggestion, Katie.
Perfect. Well, thank you for some excellent questions, and thank you to the 3 presenters for really giving us a much deeper understanding of what are in the projections, what they imply, breaking them down by place, and certainly also some of the connections to economic, health, education factors, really the kind of connected research and asking questions that are critical to understanding how these things are playing out, could play out, may not play out, and such. But please join me before we let them go in thanking our panelists for a really stimulating session.